So let's start with the first task, which is to validate the user input and generate and handle an error if we have a negative or a zero number. For that, of course, we should go to the getUserInput function, because that's where we're fetching that input. And here I actually have the same condition for all three inputs. So none of these values should be 0 or a negative value. Therefore, we can add our validation right here inside of getUserInput. And after getting that input, we can therefore add a if check and check if user input is smaller or equal than 0. And if that's the case, I wanna return an error. Or to be precise, I want to return some default value and an error. So therefore here I'll return 0 as a default value, though that won't really matter since we'll exit out of the application soon anyways. The more important part is the second return value, which should be an error. And therefore we should let Go know about that. Here, when specifying the return values, it's now no longer just one value that should be returned by getUserInput, but instead two. And the second value should be such an error value. Now, as you learn, such an error can be generated with help of another package that's part of the standard library, the errors package. And when you have multiple imports, you might want to organize them by wrapping parentheses around them and then storing one import per line. But it's this errors package that will help us. And with that package imported, we can use it to generate a new error and add an error message to that error. For example, value must be positive, or value must be a positive number. Something like this. Now, of course, since we're returning this error here as a second return value, we also must return one here. But of course, here in this situation, we have no error. That's why, as you learned, we should return nil here. This will then be the value that's used for the error if we have no error. And with that, we finished the work on the getUserInput function, and we can now go to the place where this function gets used. Here we now don't just get one value, but instead two values as return values. We get this error here as well. And we get that from all three inputs. Now with that, we can add our error handling code here and check if error is not equal to nil, which means that we have an error. And if that's the case here, I want to show an error message and exit. So here I can then use the format package to print a new line and output this error value. And as explained, that will then output that message that's connected to that error. Now, to make sure that we don't continue with the rest of the code, I'll then return here by adding a return statement. And as you learned, that will then make sure that the code thereafter does not execute if we have an error and we make it into this if block. And now we can repeat that for all the other getUserInput calls here. And basically just copy and paste this code. Now you could think that one if check here is enough, so that if I remove the other two, this one here is enough. Because it doesn't matter which getUserInput call gives us this error, the only thing that matters is that we have an error at some point, and then we want to output it and return, right? Well, if you try that and you run the application, you'll see that if I enter an invalid value for revenue, but valid values for expenses and tax rate, the app does not stop and we don't get the error message. And that's the case because, of course, error here in this if check refers to the latest value that was assigned to it. And that's, of course, the error returned by this getUserInput call. So if we entered a valid tax rate, this is nil, and we don't make it in here. So using one if check like this won't work. Now what we could do to avoid writing all this extra code here, which I'll still keep around for reference, but which I won't use here, is to give these errors different names, so that we have multiple different variables instead of reusing the same one all the time. Because whilst it is indeed the default to use a variable named error or error for storing that error, you can of course give it any name you want, like error1, error2, and error3. And then we could edit this condition here and check if error1 is not equal to nil, in which case we want to make it into this block. Or if error2 is not equal to nil, in which case we also want to make it into this block. And I only briefly mentioned this operator, but you can use this operator to combine multiple conditions as alternative conditions, so that you make it into this block if at least one of them is met. And we could also therefore add the third condition, that error3 is not equal to null. So now if we have any error, we'll make it in here, and then, since the error messages will always be the same, we can output any of them. So that would be one way of using just one if statement for handling all these errors. So with that, if I execute this and I have an invalid revenue but valid expenses and tax rate, I still get that error and the application exits. So that's one way of achieving this with one if statement. But of course, we can also instead use multiple if statements, which also often might make more sense because you might want to have different, more specific error messages for the different places where an error can occur. So you might, for example, want to refer to the specific input for which you didn't get a value. So these are simply different options you have here. In addition, besides returning, you can of course also use panic, as you learned, and output the error message like this and crash the program so that it doesn't just stop, but instead it also outputs an error trace, so extra information about where the error occurred and so on, and that would therefore be an alternative. But here I'll stick to return. And that's therefore one solution for this first task. The second task now was to store the calculated results in a file. And for that, I'll add a new function, though you don't have to do that, of course, but I will do it here, and I'll name it store results. And here I expect to get my EBT, my profit, and my ratio as results. And all three parameters should be float64 values. And then we can write to a file with help of another package I showed you earlier, the OS package. You can import it like this, it's part of Go's standard library, and you can then use it here. And call os write file, which, as you learned, will create a new file if necessary. So now we can give this file a name, and here I'll name it results.txt. And then we need to convert these values to one single byte collection. That will be fairly trivial here though, because I want to group them together into one string as a first step anyways. So that we have our results here, a new variable, which contains the result of calling fmt as printf. Now these print functions that start with a s will not print to the console, but instead generate a new string. And sprintf will generate a new string, which gives me some formatting options. Because here I want to output EBT, and then the EBT value, though, since this will be a float, I want to format it such that I only have one decimal place. Then I want to have a new line, which we can add with this line break identifier here. And also output profit, and then also format that in the same way as the EBT. Then add another new line and output the ratio, where I also want to format this, but now with 3 decimal places, let's say. And I then want to add one last new line at the end. And now we just have to pass in all these values that should replace these different placeholders in the order in which they should replace them. So EBT, profit, and ratio in this case. With that, I'll have such a results string, and as you learned, that can now be converted to such a byte collection fairly easily by using this special square brackets byte function here, which is basically the conversion function to create such a byte collection, and passing results to it. Now we just also need to specify the permissions, and here I'll use the same permissions as before in this course. And that should be all. That should now write these results in a formatted way to a file. So now we can call store results, for example here at the end of the main function, and pass EBT, profit, and ratio to that function. And if we now save everything, I have no other files besides GOMOD and the profit calculator and the gitignore file right now, but if I save this now, and we then run this application, and we enter some valid values here, like this, you see I get my output here, but more importantly, I got this results text file here. And in that file, we now find these results output and formatted in the way I specified in the code. And that's therefore how you can use if statements, errors, and how you can work with files.